She requires barely an introduction. The artista impressionista di grande magnificenza, Alina Gray, has recently been voted the #1 most popular Magia Record character, while at the same time also being voted the #1 most hated Magia Record character. How can one character be both best and worst? Is she a crazy lunatic, or is she perhaps a complex and troubled character in need of guidance? Or maybe she is even both of that. Hello and welcome, I'm the Rosiel, and today we'll be taking a look at the artista della vita e della morte, Alina Gray. Alina's story begins at the end of Karen's Magical Girl story. Alina has gathered renown as an artista in Kamehama by winning an award for her art, while at the same time gaining a notoriety for being a little bit crazy. Not as crazy as Kaneko, at least. We find Alina talking to Karen about her work, while also taking her time to admonish Karen as she usually does, and Alina narrates that even though she won the award, she was never aiming for a win and just simply wanted to create some art in the same way that she always does. She just liked creating that specific piece of art in that moment. The school intercom then suddenly starts up with a message for Alina telling her to come to the faculty room, but Alina simply ignores that message since she doesn't have any interest in talking to anyone about her art. Here's the first big hint at what Alina's art actually means to her that we get right here. Alina makes art not to impress other people or to influence people or to get famous or money or anything like that. She just wants to make art that she feels is right, art that she herself likes, art that she uses as an expression of herself, and external recognition is just not part of that equation whatsoever. So since Alina was a no-show to that meeting, the art judge that was supposed to meet her basically sent a letter to Alina and just had Karin deliver that letter. And Alina actually apologizes directly to Karin for having to deliver such a letter in her stead. And Alina, while reading the letter, actually comes to despise what the letter read and runs away again. The letter, what it reads is, it praises her for her art. It also posits, though, that Alina has no actual discernible theme to her art, and it describes that Alina's art basically only really has worth if she actually has a theme to it, and that she should use that art to make an impact on the world, and she just doesn't. And so instead, what she should do is she just stop making art. Alina, while reading this, starts questioning herself, and she ponders if her art really does have any meaning or any message to it. And to Alina, well, all this time she simply just created the kind of artworks that she herself felt comfortable with, and she never really put any deeper thought into anything that she created whatsoever. To gather more information on herself, Alina then visits the Mizuna Museum and asks the curator there, who happens to be Mayu, to look up her personal profile, and Alina inspects her own personal profile and is kind of displeased with what she finds. Her profile features way too much intimate detail of her life, and Alina herself thinks that it would be way better if it was just a basic version instead. We do get to see her profile though, and the profile that we as the reader get gives us the following information. At the age of 8, Alina already came into the contact with the death of her grandparents and her pet, which already made her ponder the transition from life to death. She then spent the next years of her life creating art that demonstrated the boundary between life and death, creating artworks that used the dead as a base and then infused it with colors and life. However, Alina is unable to discern her own theme when she looks back at these art pieces, and she grows even more frustrated. Alina wonders that her artworks are like a poison that draws people in, as Mayu tells her, but since they have no message or theme attached to them, they don't actually have any meaning. Back at school, however, Alina's frustration swells even more and she damages her own artwork on purpose as she did before, destroying it and asking Karen to take a picture of her as she keeps her rampage going. Even this, however, does not actually satisfy Alina, and she concludes that she has nothing to herself and that her very being is empty inside. Some days later, Alina and Karen meet again at school, but Karen notices that something is wrong, something is off with Alina. Alina wants to know why Karin makes manga, and when Karin tells her that she wants to spread joy to her readers, Alina remarks that Karin might actually be more of a genius than her. Alina is not satisfied with this, however, and just runs away. She figures that she still has no theme and only creates poison to others. Alina decides that the only way to continue from this point, since she has done nothing so far and all of her work amounts to nothing, is to simply end everything. End all of her artwork and destroy it all, including herself. Kyubey overhears this and wants to get Alina to contract with her and to become a magical girl, and even tells Alina that something must be deeply troubling her, but Alina just simply says that she has no wishes and she doesn't know what Kyubey means. And so Alina refuses to become a magical girl and just does what Alina does best, she just runs away. Next day, Alina discards her personal belongings and heads over to Mizura Museum, where a poor Mayu has to watch Alina destroy all of her own artwork. Alina then runs away again and heads to the roof of a nearby hospital. She heads towards the edge, where she has set up a camera on the ground below. On her walk to the edge though, she meets Kyubey once again, who pesters her once again about becoming a magical girl, and this time Alina does reluctantly agree, just so that Kyubey, the little white furball, goes away and leaves her alone. And her wish this time that she wishes for is to just have an atelier where she can be undisturbed from anyone else, or she can be just by herself. After this, she then immediately jumps from the building and crashes into the ground below, ending her life. With Alina's human life ended, she thinks once again about her art and finally realizes that her art does have a theme: the beauty of Alina. With this, Alina regrets her suicide just as she dies. And yet, this was not the end for her, because as a magical girl, her body was more resilient than a regular human body, and so her rotting corpse was found, she was put in the hospital, and her soul gem ended up healing her wounds and she came back to life again. Of course, Karin was there by her bedside all this time, and she is absolutely distressed over Alina's attempted suicide, and of course she cries her heart out. Karin then gives Alina a collection of Phantom Thief Kirin mangas for Alina to read, so that Alina might somehow in there find worth in treasuring life. Of course, Alina absolutely despises Kirin, which is why when Karin leaves the room, she of course reads the entire manga. No one else is actually watching her at this point, and yet Alina still decides to take up Karin on her offer and read the entire Kirin manga section, because after all, Alina somehow is still a human in that sense. Like, no human on this planet can ever say no to Karin. Later, Alina is visited by Toka and Nemo, who apparently were the ones who found her dead on the hospital roof, and after having a little chat with them and them going away, Alina is once again greeted by Kyubey, who tells her about the world of magical girls, because she kind of skipped that part of the tutorial early on. And armed with this knowledge, Alina then jumps into action to hunt familiars and witches. And somehow, to the surprise of Kyubey and probably the reader as well, Alina actually kind of finds beauty in the witches and wants to study them as art pieces. Right after this is when, in main story, Alina would save Ui's life by erecting a barrier around her and capturing her witch, setting main story into motion. After reading her MSS, the question of course arises: do we believe that Alina is insane? Is she malata di mente? Of course, I personally say that her MSS is easily one of the best of all in Magia Record. So her being many people's favorite #1 character is easily understandable. If you just see this magical girl story, you can be like, oh yeah, of course, of course she's a favorite of all the people. This is a really good MSS. However, and this is probably the biggest however that I've ever said in my entire fucking life, that was only the Alina that we see in her magical girl story. So let's switch over to main story Alina. Oh look, it's Alina trying to kill everyone to preserve Felicia's hair. What the actual fuck is going on in main story? Why the fuck is she trying to kill everyone? Yeah, this is the main reason why Alina is such a massively divisive character, because she acts so differently in the main story. It's kind of hard to even call both the same person. How is this even possible? How is it that the side story Alina, this deeply complex character that has failed to live up to the expectations that the people around her put in her artwork, she failed to live up to the expectations of the museum curator Mayo, who believed that Alina's art was to be shown to the masses, to the people, as important works of creativity. She failed the expectations of her best friend and girlfriend Karin, who put her faith into Alina as her senpai. Yet Alina herself admitted that Karin was smarter than her in the field of art because she understood what it means to be an artist more than Alina does. She failed the expectations of the critical art world in general via the letter of the art critic. Alina believed that she failed all of their expectations, plus her own expectations, and therefore she chose that the only way to go forward is to end everything, to put a lid on it, and end even herself. How can a character as conflicted, as complex as that exist? And then you have main story, where she just goes, murder goes brrrr. This is not even a question of chronology, because the Halloween event plays after this, where Alina selflessly helps Karin with altruistic motives. Not selfless motives, but altruistic motives. And gives Karin some of the most important advice Karin ever needed to hear, to be the only person who was able to give this advice to Karin, a sign of actual friendship. When just before in main story, Alina went on about how she was going to rip Felicia's hair out while killing her. What the actual fuck is going on here? So, at this point, going forward, there are two paths you can follow. You can follow Alina's path as the troubled artist by reading Karin's MSS, which shows her past before being a magical girl. There's also the magical Halloween theater event, and there's also Holy Alina's MSS. On the other hand, you have the entirety of main story, where Alina early on is in the timeline suggests to Toka that they should use harsher methods to gather energy, which, and I need to mention this, did not include actually killing anyone, until later in the timeline around chapter 5, when Alina made her first appearance to the players by trying to kill everyone. First impressions are pretty darn powerful, and I do think I need to mention that the very first time that most players ever saw Alina was her being a bloodthirsty psycho killer, which, compared to everything we've seen of her just going through the timeline from before being a magical girl, through her origin story all the way up to now, actually kind of looks really out of character for Alina at this point. I'm sure she makes some art that includes death as like a core part of her theme, and she does have problems socializing well, and she has severe trouble vocalizing her emotions in a way that aren't self-destructive. But on the other hand, she never voiced any direct malice towards people other than just wanting to be left alone so that she can create art in solitude, which was also her wish. And the second core part is also that her theme, besides death, is life and rebirth. However, I'm not trying to argue that Alina in main story is not the real Alina, outside of making memes maybe sometimes. But the Alina that we see in main story is indeed the real deal, but I'm trying to get through that Alina cannot simply be judged on what you see of her in the main story alone. There are valid reasons to put Alina on a pedestal as a great character, an awesome character, I love her, but there are also reasons to despise, to hate Alina, be frustrated by her, and that is what makes her so divisive in the community. So what does Alina do next in main story? She keeps trying to kill Team Megasuki, she works together with Toka and Nemu to soundlock Burgisnacht, she even in the end wants to sacrifice her body pillow Mifuyu, actually that might be a real person, to Eve in the end, and then when Ui gets saved and everyone gets their memories back, Alina basically is gone already, because at this point she just gets mind controlled by the rumor of the fur god, and she even specifically says that she is acting by the will of the rumor, which leads to her getting yeeted off screen, where she will be brought back from whenever the writer feels like it, don't worry about that. If you either like or dislike Alina, there are two narratives from all of this that you can extrapolate in regards to as to what the intentions of the writers were. You could argue that main story Alina is the unhinged and unrestrained Alina that is the closest to Alina's real desires for who she wants to be and who she would be if she wasn't being restrained by anything, while her MSS and other stories involving her are simply an attempt by the writer to add some depth to the psychopathic killer that is Alina. On the other hand, you could argue that Alina was given a complex backstory with special motivations and ideals to create a more unique character for the setting of Magia Record, and this is her real self. But when the later parts of main story were being planned by the writers, the writers just said, hey, we should have some one-sided and obviously evil villains so that our protagonists can just fight against them very easily, which also explains Toka's behavior, but also was used as an excuse to make Alina as one-dimensionally evil as possible so that the protagonists can just duke it out, even though she actually is just a troubled youth. I will leave it up to you guys which of these you believe, or if you have your own desires or theories on the matter. But in the end, none of that really matters right now, because we're going to continue diving deeper into what we actually do see Alina do in the story. One thing I do want to mention, however, is something that I talked about in Sana's Loretime as well. I don't think it's a healthy practice to diagnose fictional characters with real mental illnesses, and one of the reasons why I said that was that once you decide that a character has a clinical mental illness, it's kind of trivially easy to just short-circuit any discussion about them, and that is exactly what often happens when people talk about Alina in the community. People just go, nah, Alina's just fucking crazy, and they just move on. For example, why does Alina make weird art? Well, she's just crazy. Why is Alina harsh to Karin? She's crazy. Why does Alina speak Italian? Crazy. Why does Alina want to kill people in the main story? Obviously, crazy. So let's not do any of that and actually talk about Alina more closely. As her MSS shows us, she was confronted with death directly early on in her life, and that had a rather peculiar effect on her. She noticed that death is the change from animate to inanimate, and inspired by these thoughts, she then created art that tried to paint life back onto the inanimate by, for example, making skeletons move, or creating art with coal from burned animals. Her art was so enthralling to others that Alina was put on a pedestal as a great artist and a child prodigy. But there's a massively important detail that we see in her MSS about this. Alina herself looked at her own profile that details all of this, and she completely disagrees with it. She completely disregards it, stating that she just did what she felt like doing. Alina had always been creating, not for the sake of art or for the sake of a message, for popularity, for anything else. She simply did art that she just liked. That is not good for anyone else around her. So she's being lifted up by others. The critical art world, the critics, they try to find a deeper meaning or theme in her work while smoking some stuff. And Alina just doesn't understand any of that. We also see that Alina tells Karin that Karin must be a bigger art genius than her, because Karin actually does have a specific reason and motivation to do art, which Alina lacks. Seeing all of this, I think it would be intellectually dishonest to argue, just based on all of that Alina was just crazy. I think Alina was simply a kid who had expectations and ideals foisted upon her by others against her will, and struggled to accommodate any of this, leading to her to conclude that all of her art, that her entire life was a waste. Alina's suicide was definitely not the result of Alina just having some sort of mental illness, but rather it was mostly the pressure that the society of Kamihama and the art critics have forced on Alina, which she was not able to deal with. Many real artists are sick and tired of people repeatedly telling them that what their artworks mean, what their themes are, what their artwork says about the artist. People just don't want to hear that, and all the while, they put them on this high pedestal and shout about how great that artist is. Aside though from Alina as an artist, it's also obvious that Alina has some trouble socializing. She often fails to communicate her thoughts to others and frequently gets misunderstood by others. It's easy to see that Alina is an emotional shut-in and introvert who doesn't know much of social norms and would much rather just stay alone in her own atelier and just create art. That is also not something unique to just Alina, because in fact it's kind of a strong stereotype of many real-world artists as well, that they're all kind of like a little bit socially inept shut-ins. None of this is an excuse, of course, for her to be harsh to Karin, for example, but at least it's a sensible explanation that isn't, oh, she's just crazy. Something I do need to note here, though, is that even though Alina is often rough around Karin, she still does care about Karen and selflessly helps her. And no, this is not a meme, guys, this is not a meme. She actually does help Karen realize what she really wants by telling her not to give up in Karen's MSS, which leads to the greatest character growth for Karen that she's ever received. And in the Halloween event, Alina simply just decides to make costumes for Karen's play, and on top of that, once again, she helps Karen realize the mistakes in Karen's ideals and helps her grow as a character even further. In Alina's MSS, she compliments Karen as a greater genius than her, and the most smoking of all the smoking guns. After Alina's suicide, when Karen visits her in the hospital and gives her a magical Kirin manga, actually a lot of them, Alina actually reads them by herself, without Karen there. Alina has stated that she absolutely hates Kirin before this, and yet she still reads them, because Karen said to her that it would help her, that she might see the value in life, and she just takes Karen up on that. She just believes Karen and says, hey, maybe I should do that, maybe I should read some Kirin mangas. And she does it. And that is why Alikari as a ship works so well, because both Karen and Alina both benefit from each other. As mentioned during my Karen Loretime, Karen needs someone, some tough man, who can bring the hammer of reality down on her, because Karen is completely trapped by both unrealistic ideals and her chuny thoughts of imitating Kirin that has brought disaster to others and stunted her own character growth. Alina is that person to tell Karen what she needs to hear in a way that actually gets through to Karen. Because just telling her very nicely probably wouldn't get through to her. On the other hand, Alina is frequently troubled by the people around her and the art that she's creating, and she just needs someone who can both keep her down to earth and ground her in reality, while also being there for her when she requires help. And most importantly, Karen acts as a humanizing agent to Alina, keeping Alina's morals in check as much as she can while she is around. I do think both Alina and Karen are aware of this dynamic between them, which is also why Karen is the only person that Alina treats as an equal, and the only person that Alina ever gives any sort of selfless help to without demanding anything in return. Is that really an abusive relationship? Really, guys? I mean, she steals some of her strawberry milk, and even though she almost always gives her back a fresh one later, and I mean, she does say some harsh words to her sometimes, even though those words truly do help Karen and cause her to grow, and basically all of the character development that Karen ever gets is directly because of her interactions with Alina. I don't know. Mifu is often mentioned as a potential partner for Alina instead, but Alina only ever helps Mifu specifically because she wants to keep her as an art object. She specifically says this every single time she does anything for Mifu, and she frequently demands something from Mifu in return, which gives the friendship between those two a completely different meaning. It's more like Alina just ogles this object of lust, and there's not really anything else to it. So why does Alina speak Italian in the English version and English in the Japanese version? I guess she just likes doing it. I mean, we already know from her art that Alina just does whatever she feels like is right, and why not? She obviously enjoys the sounds those words make, and I mean, I do too, so why not? It sounds nice. All of this stuff that I've just talked about, though, all of the meaning and the explanations, none of it really seems to matter at all, though, if we move toward the way Alina acts in main story. And I do believe that the purpose of Alina's actions in main story were to demonstrate how Alina's searching for a theme could be led down a path that emphasizes how the burning desire to create your own perfect artwork can overturn your morals and ethics that you have, which, I guess in the case of Alina, weren't that made to begin with. I know the idea was also brought up that Alina simply naturally became this way after having spent time with Toka, and that while Alina's unconventional ideas partially influenced Toka to let go of her own morals and decide to go kill people, and that similarly in return, Toka's absolute disregard for the life of people around her that Toka views as below her, since Toka is kind of a Megoka supremacist if you didn't know about that yet, also influenced Alina to similarly stop valuing human life, and when Toka decides that, hey, let's go kill people, Alina just joyfully agrees. This would paint the picture that they both basically caused each other to become evil, and then formed this dynamic duo where Toka would tell Alina to kill people, and Alina would just rub her hands and laugh maniacally about the joy that she's about to have. I do think that framing Alina's change like this, that Toka and Alina somehow brought the worst out in each other, while Nemu just slept in the background, because that's what she always does, is a valid explanation as to why Alina was suddenly so totally fine with killing people when before she seemingly never had even thought about it. However, one small problem that I have with that is that the magical Halloween theater event where Alina helps Karin out of altruism is after chapter 5, where Alina was already revealed as a psychopathic killer. Unless you want to argue that even though Alina decided that she had no morals and that murder is fine and human life has no value or anything, while cackling maniacally, she also then suddenly does the most selfless and altruistic action that she's ever taken in her entire life. I mean, it's possible. I just don't think that the solutions to this are elegant at all. Then later on in the chronology, in Holy Alina's MSS, we see more of this reasoning as Alina decides that she has found a theme that she wants to create art with, after realizing that all of humanity is drawn to self-destruction. That's kind of also where Alina's story ends, because she kind of continues to act the way she did before in main story, until she gets mind-controlled by the Fur God rumor, and we haven't really seen her since. So whenever Alina comes back to the story, what will Alina do then? Will the writers make up new villains and therefore free Alina, since she doesn't have to be a villain anymore, to go back to her roots and become the trouble artist that she was set up to be in her Magical Girl story? Or will they decide that Alina is done being evil yet and needs to be fought again? Will Karin ever get to give Alina a real big hug, and will Alina ever be able to get over her social ineptitude to tell Karin that she really does actually value her? We will have to find out, because Alina's story is not over yet. With this, however, we have arrived at the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching. Leave a comment below if you have anything to add to this. If you want to talk about anything, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys next time.